НЛО Медиа представляет. Хроника научной жизни.
Коллеги, рада представить.
I'm very happy to introduce our fourth speaker, Ed Кейси, Stouni Bрук University, US. The title of the talk is Borders and Boundaries, How This Plays Out in Critical Situations.
Okay, so let me start. This is a talk on borders and boundaries and how it plays out in certain critical situations today. So borders and boundaries are two different kinds of edge, where edge is not the limit of a solid, that's what Plato had said, but something dynamic in its own right. Edge is something dynamic in its own right. Were it to be merely a limit, it would be exclusively negative. That is, where something ends, where it enters into nothingness. Rather, edges can be active in their own right, not where something simply terminates, but where it may begin, as when we are on the edge of a new thought that is emerging in our mind. I have argued in my recent book, The World on Edge, that edges often open onto entire worlds, allowing us an exclusive entry into them. As when we catch sight of something new, thanks to our perception of its edge, understood as an entry into that new thing. Or as when we catch sight of a bird that flies by, the contoured edge of its wing signifying that it is capable of flight. Borders and boundaries are two primary kinds of edge. Borders are clearly differentiated edges that serve to distinguish different parts of the same thing, as with the borders of one territory, as it is to be distinguished from another contiguous territory. Say, different regions of Turkey. It is typically represented by a border, is typically represented by a continuous line, a line which in English we call a border line, that is measurable in a certain number of units and thus lends itself to exact mapping. Boundaries, in contrast, resist linearization. They are inherently indeterminate, porous, and typically inhere in natural phenomena, as with the edges of a river that keeps changing shape as determined by the amount of rain that it contains. Where a border often serves to divide one country from another, a boundary connects co-inherent parts of the same phenomenon. As we say in English, a riverside or a river bank. It can even be considered, as Iamblichus said, quote, the primary cause of bodies. The primary cause of bodies is a boundary. A boundary belongs to a place or a region as its outer edge. And instead of closing off, it opens to other parts of the same place or region. In the end, borders and boundaries are complementary. One serves to distinguish and separate, the other to open onto, to make continuous by connecting. We have both, always. Borders for finding our way in the world considered as a set of coherent regions that need to be distinguished from each other. Earlier today, we heard about territories. It's the same thing. This boundaries are for reconnecting a world that has been severed into separate parts by continuous demarcations that are usually signified by border lines. The edges of landscapes, perceived or painted, This is an emergency alert saying that there's an earthquake in New York. I won't worry about it yet, although I did feel the building I am in shaking a little earlier today. Until the management comes around to my door, I think I will try to be optimistic. I'm on the top floor of a very high building, so I am a little bit vulnerable, but we'll hope this is not serious. So in the end, borders and boundaries are complementary. One serves to distinguish and separate, and the other to open onto, to make continuous by connecting. We need both. Borders for finding our way in the world, considered as a set of coherent regions that need to be distinguished from each other. Boundaries we need for reconnecting a world that has been severed into separate parts by continuous demarcations. The edges of landscapes, perceived or painted, are boundary-like in their inherent indeterminacy, whereas the edges of borders lend themselves to linear representation, as in mapping. Borders are determinate entities that lend themselves to measurement in meters or miles, whereas boundaries act to connect or reconnect or pre-connect what has been distinguished by borders. Taken together, boundaries and borders are two primary ways by which entire life worlds configure themselves. They are complementary in relation to each other. Borders act to define and delimit. Boundaries serve to ground, receive, and to open. To cite myself from this book, this recent book, World on Edge, borders close in and close off, boundaries open up and open out. We need both in making sense of a life world that would otherwise be confusingly disfigured and disorienting. Now, for the rest of this talk, let us consider two concrete contemporary cases of borders and boundaries, one stemming from the 19th century into this century, the other quite contemporary. So the first has to do with the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S.-Mexico Treaty of 1848, called the Guadalupe Hidalgo, signaled the end of Mexican-American wars. In it, the Rio-Grande River was singled out as the effective border between the two countries. This is the long river that forms the southern border of Texas. It runs from Brownsville to El Paso and is of varying width at different places along it. Sometimes this river surges with water from spring rains. At other times, typically in the summer, it runs dry, so dry that migrants can literally walk across it. You have perhaps heard about the recent drama of that river, whereby Governor Abbott of Texas has claimed the right to, quote, protect Texas from what he calls an invasion of migrants who come from somewhere south. He has laid down rolls of barbed wire in the river, wire in which human beings can become entangled to the point of sometimes drowning to death, as has happened recently. So let's think a little more carefully about this situation. The Rio Grande River, as a natural phenomenon, is a boundary, in my sense of the term, a perimeter of a part of nature that lays down its own edge, sometimes raging with water, sometimes running dry. And the many cases in between. The river is a changing band, more that than anything else, given the contingent character of the water in this river keeps changing levels and amounts. Yet the same river also counts as a border. Indeed, the official border between Mexico and the U.S. As such, it is linear and is represented by a continuous line in maps of the region. But where exactly, I ask, is the border? In the middle of the river? But this middle will itself change place in keeping with alterations in season or weather. So we have here an example of how a border and a boundary conjoin, yet in an inherently unstable way. A map of this border is to this extent misleading, for it imposes as well as reduces the border to an unchanging line, whereas the boundary, equally important in dividing the U.S. from Mexico, is inherently fluid and altering with time. We witness here an uneasy alliance between a border and a boundary as distinctive edges of two countries as they connect in and as a river that flows between them. This situation, of course, is hardly unique, especially when it concerns the ambiguous role of rivers in determining the borders of continuous countries. It's because of this ambiguity that a border wall has been built along almost all of the official border between the United States and Mexico. A mass of metal and concrete that signals to migrants that they are not welcome to the United States as undocumented asylum seekers. More existentially urgent than the seemingly self-contradictory situation to which I have pointed, that is, the uneasy combination of border and boundary in the guise of a single river, is the way that the Rio-Grande has become a goal of thousands of immigrants, hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, as it has recently been estimated, migrants from Central America and many other countries, European countries, and indeed as far away as China. These migrants aim at crossing the river. That's the decisive action that they aim at doing. They try to do so often with the assistance of a paid scout, a person who claims to lead them across the river safely. For they know that if they reach the American side, they can apply for asylum in the United States despite Governor Abbott's extreme efforts to thwart them from ever reaching the American side of the river. Here, notice a border reinforced by the border wall, about which I wrote an earlier book called Up Against the Wall. A border has become the a definite obstacle, whereas the boundary dimension of the situation remains ambiguous. It's both an avenue of border crossing and an obstacle to that crossing. Part of it and also against it. So we can say that border and boundary converge here in a complex commixture that underlines the unease, the malaise of the situation as a whole, migration into the United States. And we witness here more generally two very different edge phenomena, borders and boundaries, and that get thrown together, thrust together in a single circumstance that has profound existential and historical and political consequences. We also observe how long-lasting borders and boundaries can be. Borders for geopolitical reasons, the peace treaty of 1848, in the case that we're now discussing, is still in effect today, and boundaries because of geological realities. The Rio Grande is much the same river today as it was in the middle of the 19th century, similar as to its location, the variable flow, and the approximate position of its banks. And these same two parameters, geopolitical and geological, have persisted together, one alongside the other, for almost now 130 years. Each complements the other as if made to be with the other, despite their many differences. Now I want to turn to a contemporary situation, Israel and Palestine. Palestine has existed as the land of the Palestinian people for many centuries, a land for cultivation and inhabitation that has no single date of origin. Israel, in contrast, has claimed land for itself since the Balfour Declaration of 1917, though the decisive seizing of territory did not occur until 1947, when, in the wake of the Holocaust and spurred by Zionism, it forcefully removed Palestinians from their lands in the major step toward establishing modern Israel. Since then, Israel has made many further incursions, including numerous settlements in the West Bank that have resulted in the forcible eviction of Palestinians who formerly lived there. What these settlements have done is to dispossess Palestinians of lands they had farmed and lived on for centuries. Dispossession, or in vernacular language in English, land grabs, signify the taking over of places that were previously inhabited by others who assumed the right to continue living there, to continue living there on the basis of their long-term inhabitation of these areas. Often so long that no date can be given for the exact beginning of this inhabitation. Even if there is nothing like a formal claim to the land in question, natives who have lived on this land for millennia assume that they can continue living there indefinitely. Such an assumption is by no means restricted to Palestinians. And Native Americans, Indians as we call them, have held comparable assumptions in many areas of North America, ranging from New England to the frontiers of the Wild West. Chief Seattle, in a famous speech of 1854, said the following, quote, "The president in Washington sends word that he wishes to buy our land. But how can you buy or sell the sky, the land? The idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? Every part of the earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every meadow, every humming insect. We are part of the earth, and it is part of us." Now, to say this, as Chief Seattle did in 1854, is to assert outright that lands inhabited by natives are not to be considered properties subject to market values, sale and resale. All too often, Seattle's claim was ignored as European settlers moved into these same lands in the American Middle West, as my own ancestors did, and the Far West, and declared them to be their own. Such is the strategy of what we now call settler colonialism in many places on the earth, including many areas of Palestine, such as the West Bank, which has been subjected to the often violent seizure by Israeli settlers when the Israeli government has not officially opened these areas to settlement. Whether by outright seizure or by governmental edict, there is an effective and ongoing forceful occupation and dispossession of Palestinian territories. When these native areas are subjected to military intervention, armed intervention, as has happened all too recently, as we know, in Gaza, we have another form of dispossession, this time by means of outright physical violence and destruction. That the fate of Gaza has yet to be determined does not make the Israel intervention any less a form of dispossession, as graphically evidenced in the migration of millions of Palestinians who have been forced to flee from northern to southern Gaza recently. With bombs and tanks, Israel has established itself as controlling the fate of an area that is home to some 2 million Gazans. Happening here is a seizure of control that entails an Israeli assumption of a right to occupy and control Palestinian lands, justified in this case, for the Israelis at least, by the October 7th attack on settlers by Hamas. With the dispossession of native lands in various forceful ways, we witness a different fate for borders and boundaries than what we have so far considered. If boundaries remain in the form of edges of certain natural features of the Palestinian landscape, from local hills to olive groves, and more expansively from, as is often said these days, from the river to the sea, that means from the river of Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. This is a slogan that signifies driving Palestinians out of their homeland altogether, so that here boundaries do not merely enclose or situate, but signify places of exclusion. Borders, in contrast with this naturalistic basis of boundaries, borders show themselves to be extremely volatile. They are often the effective, quote, city limits of given Israeli settlements, limits that are radically contingent, since they have arisen by the forceful seizure of Palestinian farms, a seizure that can alter shape at any moment, depending on the actions of Israeli settlers. Ironically, there is no sale or purchase of land. To this extent, keeping with Chief Seattle's claim, but this is not because of the sacredness of the land itself, as is the case for many Native Americans. It has to do with a passion for finding room, space for Israeli settlements, room that is claimed and determined by the whims and wishes of Israeli settlers and their leaders. Now, once seizure of land has happened in a given place, borders may well be claimed as the outermost perimeters of a given settlement. But these borders are not established by any treaty between settlers and the dispossessed, in contrast with the U.S. and Mexico in 1848, that was the result of a concerted consultation between American and Mexican representatives, but in this case, in the Israeli case, by outright occupation. An occupation that has all too often involved violence on the part of the settlers, who are frequently highly armed, and increasingly so, of course, after the attack by Hamas on October 7th. In a recent incident, for example, and this is one of many thousands of such examples, a single rifle shot killed a Palestinian man, Bilal Saleh, who was harvesting olives on a farm he had inherited from his forebears. This murder was not pursued by Israeli police, so that the shooter is not known, though we may assume it was an Israeli settler. But this deadly action left Bilal Saleh's home, his family rather, bereft, and forced them to flee to another location, abandoning the family farm and thus opening it to early Israeli Israeli occupation. The United Nations reports that nearly 600 attacks of this kind by settlers in the West Bank have occurred since the event of October 7th. Many of these were closely affiliated with efforts to occupy Palestinian lands and thus to alter the effective local borders in a given region. Now, in this troubled part of the Middle East, borders and boundaries take on very different valences than they have in more established circumstances, as with the US-Mexico border that is labeled La Frontera, literally the frontier, which has held steady now for a very long time, and continues to be located in the Rio-Grande River, construed as a boundary that doubles as a border. In Palestine today, as settled by Israelis, we see both of these two major kinds of edge take on a different role. On the one hand, borders become highly contingent, dependent on the actions of individual settlers, actions often sanctioned or at least permitted by Israeli authorities, and undergo frequent changes in shape and extent. On the other hand, boundaries are reduced to being the outlying edges of farmlands, including groves and orchards that are subject to outright dispossession on the part of settlers. Notice that in all that I have just discussed, land figures prominently. This is far from trivial or to be taken for granted. It's the very basis of borders and boundaries alike. As we have seen, land is something possessed by way of inhabitation, whether for centuries or much more recently. In neither case is it something owned, as in a capitalist economy. Rather, it is something appropriated by those who live on it. This is especially true for those who have inhabited land, a given land, for long periods, during which they work the land, as we say in English. They farm the land, they cultivate the land, often over several generations. Thanks to this continuing labor, those who live on it can rightly and reasonably claim it as theirs, without, however, having to claim that they own it. Moreover, for long-term inhabitants, we cannot easily detach borders and boundaries from the lands they configure. It is if they are accompaniments of land, accompaniments that help to orient and sustain the human beings who live there. Only in a negative twist, such as a desperate need for money to purchase what fulfills basic needs, will they be tempted to claim it as their, quote, property. But all too often, when it comes to those who seek to aggrandize their, what again in English we call estate, a telling term that implies what remains fixed in place, estate, it is a matter of claiming land as their own, even if they have no right to this claim, other than a wish for sheer aggrandizement, for having increasingly more land as a concrete sign of their dominance and their right to occupy parts of a given region. So here we witness the roots of capitalist economies, that is, forms of ownership that carry with them a measurable monetary value. Such economies thrive on the determination of precise borders that convey the exact size of a given piece of property, allowing it to enter a market economy where real estate values, as we call it in the West, require such borders as integral to the extent of land. That is what we say in English is a plot of land that can be owned or sold. Plot, by the way, etymologically is closely related to place. And of course, everything I've been discussing today, we can say, has to do with the determination of the extent and limits of place. I move to a last set of thoughts here. Boundaries, as I have discussed them, point in another direction. They point toward the acknowledgement of respect for the inherent topography of nature, what is given to human beings rather than taken. As such, boundaries are intrinsic to land, to its configuration and character. Pressing further in this direction, we realize that boundaries inhere in earth. Earth construed as that which underlies land itself. Earth as underlying is resistant to specification in terms of real estate values, much as Chief Seattle claimed. It is, let's say, pre-monetary, just as it precedes the manifestation of power, such as we find in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. If land can lend itself to specification in surely quantitative terms, think of a potato patch or a cornfield or a set of trees as configurations of and on the land. Earth resists any such effort at exact determination. Here I'm headed toward a thesis I'm working on in a separate book. Land is a layer upon earth. As such, it is intrinsically twofold. Land. It faces upward when it lends itself to agriculture and human constructions that are set on it, on the land, but it tilts downward as emerging from earth, which resists human machinations and manipulations. As such, it will never figure, that is, earth, as real estate, nor will it ever possess property value. It precedes determination by borders as well. Borders inhere in land or at sea. For earth underlies boundaries that configure land in ways that help humans and animals and plants to orient themselves on earth. Chief Seattle's claim that land cannot be given a price is all the more true. Indeed, it is foremost true of earth. For earth is the ultimately priceless element in human and animal and plant life. It precedes borders and boundaries alike, though the former more than the latter. It is the factor bypassed and ignored by real estate agents and colonialist settlers alike. It is the elemental a priori, there from the beginning and still there as long as there is life on this planet. As Patricia Montour-Angus writes recently, I quote her, she's an anthropologist, although Aboriginal peoples maintain a close relationship with the land, the issue is not about control of the land. Rather, earth is mother and she nurtures us all. Sovereignty, when defined as my right to be responsible rather than my right to own, requires a relationship with territory and not a relationship based on control of that territory. She's still speaking here. What must be understood then is that the Aboriginal request to have Earth's sovereignty respected is really a request to be responsible to Earth. Now, one consequence of this last line of thought you may find abstract, but in any case, I think it's something worth discussing and pursuing, that of Earth first, as what precedes and nourishes all that inhabits land, is that the more we acknowledge the priority of Earth the less we can keep borders and boundaries apart. We saw such separation in the case of the U.S.-Mexico border, La Frontera, as it is called in Spanish, when the border between the U.S. and Mexico could indeed be, and still is, represented by a line, while the boundary was identified, you recall, with the Rio-Grande River, an ever-changing flow of water. But in the case of Israel, since 1947, the distinction between borders and boundaries begins to collapse. The borders of Israeli settlements are ever-changing as their residents seek to expand the reach of their political and military power. Mapping them would be futile, given the rapidity of settlement expansion. But in the face of the forced occupation of new territory, the natural features of the landscape recede in importance. Features that I maintain are the very basis of boundaries, construed as inherent configurations of land. Land, that is, the outer surface of the earth itself. Thank you. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Edward. Paul Vert.
For this
Yeah,
talk, I'll
please.
also leave the Israel issue maybe on the side in large measure. I guess I have two questions. One has to do with, I suppose, the distinction between natural borders, or I'm thinking about the Rio Grande in particular, where it seems to me, based on my understanding, and I don't claim any expertise in this, is that there's been, and you mentioned the wall, of course, but all kinds of natural infrastructural changes. It seems to me, I remember reading a book by someone named Alvarez about all the concrete that's been poured precisely to control the river, that is, to make it more sort of predictable, which is not to say that it's always complied with that, but nonetheless, there has been that attempt. So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about a bit about sort of infrastructural interventions in making distinctions between natural borders or borders defined by natural phenomenon and ones like, for example, the border between Israel and Gaza, which to the best of my recollection is a fairly straight line. And I wonder if I'm supposed to check my speaking language there. It's English. I guess I'll use that for now. And then the other question has to do with the idea of sovereignty, which came up in the anthropologist that you were citing. But it seems to me sovereignty may be less in the sense of responsibility to the earth in the way you were describing and the way that anthropologist was describing, and maybe more in the sense of precisely claiming control. And here again, I would make a distinction between the two cases that you're offering. One is that I think, at least now, both the United States and Mexico recognize their sovereignty as extending to that line or to that boundary area, however problematic it may be. Whereas it seems to me in the case of Israel, as far as I know, there's no claims to sovereignty, for example, over Gaza, or maybe in the case of the West Bank, it's more complicated. But it seems to me that sovereignty is actually a category that it seems very relevant here, both in the two cases, and I think more generally and theoretically. Thank you.
Yes, just to comment briefly on that, you're right about the Rio Grande. It does keep changing shape and size. And then, of course, the two countries attempt to control that. And why are they doing that? So that it can become more mappable, predictable, and controllable. And so I see that as part of an effort to convert what is, in fact, a natural boundary, as rivers always do, into the basis of being a border, even if the border itself is an artificial delineation, which is laid down by human beings in their imaginations and in their maps upon a natural phenomenon like the river. So the river, in this respect, has a kind of being of its own. It asserts itself, you might say, against the rigid linearization of it in the form of the U.S.-Mexico border, so-called. And so I think that your example is exactly one of the struggle that goes on between natural boundaries, here determined by water earth, edges, beaches, even there are beaches actually in the Rio Grande, and the international borders that nations claim that they share or that are contiguous to both those nations. So I see it as part of an ongoing drama, and you're right to say that it changes all the time. I've been going to this part of the world for many years in my own research, and every time I get to the river, it's a different river. It's extraordinary. Nevertheless, it's still called the Rio Grande River, and it nevertheless is the natural basis of what we call the U.S.-Mexico border. I go into a very elaborate description in my book about the effort to locate the border in the middle of the Rio Grande River. But the problem with that is, of course, the Rio Grande River keeps changing its size, shape, and extent. And so, of course, it's a losing battle in that respect. But it's going on. It continues. It's a struggle to this very day. In Israel and Palestine, I agree, of course, there are sometimes border lines drawn, and you're right, between Israel and Gaza, for example, that's been recognized since at least 1947, if not earlier. But notice how arbitrary they are when it comes to the actual landscape of those two countries, which doesn't simply divide into two parts. It's arbitrary. It's historically specific. It's obviously subject to change, although it has lasted now for some decades. But my interest is really in how the natural shape of the landscape influences what come to be regarded as rigid borders. And I will bet that in the case of Israel, much as it would not like to admit it, the role of natural boundaries is far stronger and more powerful than would be admitted by the government, which is really interested in claiming precise limits to the land they control. So we'd have to go into detail. We'd literally have to go and do a study of that line that's been drawn on maps, at least, between Israel and Gaza, to see how it configures with the local landscape. And I think it would be quite telling, fascinating, rich, complicated, not as simple as the map line, right, would pretend to be. But much more to say here, and I appreciate your questions because they're things I'm concerned about myself.
Татьяна.
Yes, I forgot actually what I wanted to ask, but let me recall it. I liked very much your idea of returning to this pre-monetary, not real estate status of the earth, to restore this elemental a priori or inherent topography of nature, its intrinsic value. So it sounds for me like a kind of ethical imperative or an ethical maxim. And it also sounds for me as a kind of a deep ecological intuition. I wanted to ask if you know whether ecologists or ecological activists elaborate on this idea in their projects.
Yes. Go ahead. Please.
It was my first question, and the second was whether you see any possibility to convert this liberation from politics of borders into politics itself. So if it's possible to implement your politics of boundary politically. For example, we imagine a kind of ideal government who would like to implement this politics of boundaries instead of politics of borders. Would it be feasible? Would it be possible to do it? Would it be realistic?
Yes. Okay. Well, just a brief answer, Tatiana. Thank you for those questions. Yeah, I was verging toward an environmentalism. I didn't use the word or ecology, but I did want to try to find a place. There we are again. But now in concept and language for the way in which boundaries come to us from the landscape, from the surrounding. We don't impose them as we do borders, actually, arbitrarily and nationalistically, as we've just heard about. But we absorb, you might say, boundaries from being in certain landscapes. I actually live, for the moment, right across from Central Park. This was designed by the same architect, which our last speaker referred to as designing the Stanford campus. That is Olmsted. And Olmsted wanted to put into New York, which is otherwise a maze of borders. These are very rectilinear streets, of course, right? North, south, east, west. Something that would be defiant of all that would actually involve lakes, trees, rocks, and much of it was actually respecting the original landscape of this part of the world. So we can say that he was actually an early environmentalist. He was really saying that the environment is an integral, not a secondary feature of human experience of space. It has to be, as it were, valorized. And if you do, you move quickly toward a politics of environmentalism, of the preservation, indeed the support, the active support of different forms of life. I've been doing some research on the way in which entire forests were removed from the southern part of the United States unthinkingly and massively and destructively in the 19th century. There was no sense that anything valuable was being removed. It was all for the sake of profit, as you can imagine. This seems to me now to be in question, and it's a very good thing that it's in question. And my work on place and boundary is an effort to say that in our actual ongoing experience, quite apart from a theory of it, which I as a philosopher can't seem to resist, we have to walk among naturally given boundaries instead of being regimented by arbitrarily imposed borders. To this extent, I disagree with our last speaker, because it seems to me that the potential of boundaries, what I'm calling boundaries, which are linked to land and earth, are much more important to recognize and to valorize at this historical moment, indeed ongoing. So yes, my work on space is headed toward a phenomenological environmentalism, I guess we could call it, in which boundaries would be given a new force, a new recognition, instead of our being entangled in disputes and arguments over precise borders, where borders are not only nationalistic, but of course I'm also using borders in the sense of what I was calling plots of land that then can be put up for sale and traded and, valorized, monetized, all of that. We have enough of that. We've had too much of that. So how to reintroduce a world in which boundaries are become primary agents of change becomes a political issue and a personal issue too, it seems to me, as well. I'm a landscape painter in addition to being a philosopher. And so I try to paint this sense of naturally given, spontaneously offered natural boundaries in a seascape or a landscape that I'm painting, often abstractly, but it doesn't matter. They're nevertheless, their presence, I hope, is felt. And to me, that's a way of moving toward a more adequate ecology than in most linguistic efforts. I mean, here I am, a philosopher, I write, of course. But I think it's important to note that writing often discourages full recognition of the presence, the powerful presence of what I'm calling boundaries. So if you go, to the Rio-Grande, which I discussed, it's an incredible river that keeps changing course, keeps changing shape. It's almost like it's asserting its autonomous being against the effort to reduce it to a border between the United States and Mexico. But as I've been saying, it's both. And how can it be both becomes a very interesting topic to pursue, to allow space for the very concept of boundary as a porous perimeter. I'd put it that way, a permeable perimeter becomes critical, whereas borders pretend to be impermeable, rigid, lasting. And unfortunately, most nations have indeed relied upon the determination of borders. So I'd have to have a further discussion with our last speaker about the desirability of national borders. I just want to take us in a different direction, that's all, toward naturally given boundaries. So that's a bare response to Tatiana to, I hope, both of your questions, but it would take volumes to spell it out. I'm working on some of this. Just wrote a book on plants called The Place of Plants, arguing that their sense of placement is equally important, if not more important, than our sense of place, which is highly historical and overdetermined. And so I try to bring forward the way in which plants auto-generate, they generate from within themselves a very special way of being on Earth that we can learn from as human beings. Not that we become plants, but that we begin to respect ways of being in connection with the Earth that are imaginative, ingenious, vital. Elan vital of Bergson comes to mind as a helpful way of thinking of this side of the world of borders and boundaries. So much more to say, but thank you, Tatiana, for your questions.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Casey. And the future discussion will go on, I'm sure, because the topic you touched is very itchy and very important.